You all ready to learn about vSAN?
Yeah, wake up, man. You need more coffee.
I'm still on my first cup.
Welcome to this sold-out, house-full event of introducing PowerOps to you guys. So, what we are doing today, it's not the arena, and I'm not Pat, but we are still launching something. It's not at the scale as other announcements, but we're today launching a new tool, a community-based tool for day two operations of NSX called NSX PowerOps. It's available for you guys to download and start using in your NSX environments. My name is Hamad Alam. I'm part of NSBU customer success team as a solutions architect.
And my name is Puneet Chawla. I'm also part of solutions architect on NSBU side. We're going to start our presentation with a disclaimer. This is a very standard disclaimer for you to attend the presentation. And I'll go over the agenda of the presentation today. Today we're going to go over, wrong button, NSX PowerOps, why we build this tool, and what was the reason for building the tool, and who we build it for. So we'll go over a little bit background. After that, we'll do a little bit under the hood, what the tool is made of, what are the modules we're using underneath it, and we'll also do a live demo, finger crossed. After that, we'll wrap up with any questions that you guys might have, and we'll also show what we're currently working on and what's coming in the next releases.
So can I get a quick show of hands? How many of you are Power CLI users, in your environment? Perfect. How many of you know about Power NSX? Very good. Excellent. You have to know. You created the tool. So actually for giveaways later, we have a book on Power NSX. So a couple of you guys, if you want, you can come and get it. So I want to talk initially about what is this tool about? Why are we creating it? What is it for? So if you guys have an NSX environment, so that's my another poll. How many of you have a NSX environment deployed in any state? Wow, majority of you. Perfect. So hopefully you like it. So what we are trying to do as a solutions architect team, Puneet, me, and a few of my folks, colleagues up here, is we engage with customers for various phases in their NSX journey. It can be during POC, pre-sales, design session, implementation, day two operations, and all the middle steps in between. So between me and Puneet, we have done more than 250 NSX deployments. We have touched those deployments at these different phases. So we have immense amount of knowledge about how NSX is being used in the environment. So when we engage with the customers and we enable them, the enablement, we don't want to keep the enablement just tied over there. What we do is we take the learning from those engagements and we bring it back to the BU. And we file the enhancements, the requests, and bring the use cases and tell them. But as you can imagine, any feedback or any enhancement or anything that we request from that time to it being productized, being part of the product out of the box, that's easily 6 months to a year in the middle, right? So what do we do in the middle during that time? How do we fill the gap? And that's where me and my team, we like to take initiatives to build tools and build scripts, build things that the community, the NSX users can use. Power NSX is a great example of that, which comes out of our team and is continuously being developed. Over 32,000 lines of code in it now. And all internally built, and reason was, we saw that REST API, the consumption and the UI consumption was not as efficient for day two operations, and we saw the gap and we filled it, right? And we're continuously trying to improve on it. Same principles we are taking to PowerOps. What we see, there are 2 to 3 major pillars that I see that customers like you are experiencing. The first one is that when NSX is deployed, PSO deployed it, you deployed it, whoever deployed it, the only documentation is when the initial deployment was made, day 0. Right, you documented everything, you're good to go, you got your nod from project managers and everything is good. But when days and weeks and months go by, I have not really seen any customer who's updating those documents. So what happens is 6 months or a year down the road, the documentation is now obsolete because environment has grown, new things have been created, policies have changed, new logical switch, routing, and all those things. So now what happens is if you run into any issue, a problem happens, and everybody is starting to troubleshoot, you're like, okay, what did it look like when it was working? And a lot of times you don't have those answers. If you're, for example, looking at routing tables, like you see the routing table, which oftentimes looks okay, but definitely there's something changed, right? So what was it like when it was working? So there is no baseline. So the first pillar of PowerOps tool is around documentation. So what we're trying to do is we're creating documentation for your environment, connecting to your environment with a very simple menu-driven tool, and it will collect information about your environment and document it. Now, when I say documented, where does it document, and why is that document good? So when I'm trying to find some information or do anything, my best friend is Control F or Command F. I want to be able to find things. I type a string, I want to be able to just quickly find it and see what it is configured as or not. You can't really do that in NSX UI. And the context switching makes it even more problematic. So what we are doing is we are documenting your environment into Excel files. So what will happen is you say, document my NSX components, document my routing, document my host information, and it will create Excel files for you for that information. And the information is coming back from what we've learned from the customer. I'm not dumping like thousands of lines of things. What I'm dumping is the things which are critical for you to operationalize your environment and troubleshoot, like things about that really matter to the configuration and well-being of NSX environment. So that's the first pillar of it. The second pillar is security. So NSX security, it's great, the functionalities are awesome, but when you talk about usability, the user experience, the UI experience, and even if you're using a scripting tool to get information, again, for architects and engineers, cool, great. But what about the day 2 ops guys? That big team, the skill set may vary, and they may not be as into NSX as some of the other guys maybe, right? So what they need is they need something that's easily consumable for them, that they can look at and it makes sense to them. They don't have to know like 50 commands to find that information. So with the security posture documentation, we're documenting your security posture into, again, an Excel file. So now if you want to say, well, I want to do a Control F because I have an app called Inventory and there's a web switch on it or web policy on it, I can do a Control F on that. If I want to find out which port in the services is representing port 9000, it's very difficult in the UI, and I'm not bashing the UI, it's great, but I'm talking about usability and day 2 ops. Sometimes even the simplest of the tasks can be difficult, right? And time consuming, especially when you are in a troubleshooting scenario, and time to resolution becomes so big because before you can troubleshoot anything, you need to find that information, right? So that's what we are trying to do with the security posture. And lastly, what we are doing is we have health check tools that you can use to monitor your environment and check the health of the environment. Obviously, it's not exhaustive. It's not everything that NSX has or all the health checks there are, but the tool is in a very modular format so that we can add things. Another thing to take away is that what I mentioned initially was we are doing the fill the gap. Right? So as product matures and the issues or enhancements are coming in, some of the tools that were useful may not be still useful because the product is taking care of it. But the idea is we're giving the tools that really go deep down and validate the health, not just from a UI perspective, but really deep down in the mechanics and opening the hood and validating how things are working. So the whole idea is that in a distributed system, a lot of operations teams are not really tuned into troubleshooting distributed systems, or they have not had the opportunity to do that. So how do they correlate the desired state, the configured state, with the realized state, like what actually got implemented at the data plane level? So that correlation sometimes is a hard thing for operations teams to do. So in our documentation, what we're doing is we're putting the desired state and the realized state together, so you can see this is my BGP neighbor, and what was the routing or the route tables that resulted in this from this BGP neighbor relationship. You see it right there. We'll show you some of the outputs later. I don't want to go too deep into that, but that's the whole idea. And essentially what we're trying to do, if you are the ops guy, more of no work is better than less work, and that's what we're trying to do, is that we reduce the amount of work that you have to do so you can focus on other things.
Sounds great, Hamad. I have a question. How come everything's pointing towards the coffee mug?
So there are two answers to that. Number one, you are not allowed to ask questions. That's for these guys. And the second thing is that's a coffee that you didn't have in the morning.
That's right. All right, moving forward, before I show you the demo of the product, I'd like to quickly go over what's really under the hood. So the tool is based on Power CLI, and we're using multiple modules within Power CLI, either provided by third party, like SSH module, which is Posh SSH, or Pester for our testing. But within the documentation and health check, we created every functionality as a module itself. This will help us troubleshoot the issues, and not only that, going forward, this is a community-based tool, so if customer wants to add new, let's say, health check, all they have to do is create an independent module, submit the code, we'll review it, and we'll include it with the main repository. So it's a very modular-based tool, so it's easy to contribute to. Another very important part is Power NSX. Most of you guys know what Power NSX is. If you do not, I will highly encourage you to go over the session that Nick and Dale provided yesterday. It's a recording, and we also have a few books for you. And Nick just stepped out, otherwise he would have signed those books. We're also using Central CLI and REST APIs. These are the tools we're using to pull the information from either vCenter or NSX and document it for you in the documentation, or do the health check for it. In the end, as Hamad mentioned, most of the information is provided within Excel. It's just easier to... Yes, it draws picture, and we'll show you a demo of it. That's really a cool tool, because for me personally, it's very easy for me to visualize things, either diagram. So
to double click on what he said about modularity, I don't want to take credit that all of the stuff that we are showing you is built by us. It's not built, some of it, half of it is built by us, not us, by him, so blame him. But other than that, the modularity is, that's the essence, that these tools and the scripts were built for different customers, different scenarios. You know, the diagram visual tool was built by Nick. So what we're doing as a modular function is bringing all those tools in and putting it under this one umbrella. And the wrapper is going to help you to get the information, and then it can get information based on Power NSX, REST API, Central CLI, Power CLI, you name it, right? So you have a nice wrapper, because as architects and engineers, your responsibility is to give your operations team tools that they can use to run the environment. And if you see a gap, it's very easy for you to contribute and fill that gap.
Okay. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into a quick demo. I'm going to be switching my screens to one of my workstations. This is one of the Power CLI window I already created, and already installed NSX PowerOps, and I already have prerequisite installed. When you're going to install the prerequisites, we have a really cool README file, which will give you step-by-step instruction of what you need before you run this program. So let's go ahead and run it. It's a CLI-based, very simple program. It's also a menu-based program. I'm sorry if you can't see the blue part in the back or in the front. It's just a projector.
So just double down on that. So we thought about making it bigger so like you guys can see it, but it's a very dynamic menu. So on your screens, when you're using it on your laptops and things, it's going to maximize and centralize and everything. So we didn't want to screw with the code to mess with anything. So apologize if some of you can't see it, but most of it it'd be visible.
Right. So I'll go over, when you launch the product, you'll see the main menu. I'll go over a few of the options we have here. The first one is to install Power NSX. We love Power NSX. It's a really powerful tool, and we're mostly using that to gather most of the information. So you have to have it. We automated a process to install it. All you have to do is over here hit 1, and it will install the Power NSX for you. If you already have Power NSX installed, it will check for an update. If it needs an update, it will update it for you. I already have an update copy, so I'm not going to run that. Second command is to connect to the NSX Manager and vCenter. While testing it yesterday, I
fat fingered it 15
times.
So I said, let's not do it in the live demo.
So I already connected it just before the demo. The cool thing about the connection with NSX Manager and vCenter through this is when we're going to do documentation and health checks, we make several connections. The scripts or different modules are making those connections, but you don't have to provide the password again and again. We'll use the same credentials or the session to connect with the NSX Manager vCenter. So I already have that connected. The other two are the main options, the documentation menu and the health check menu. These are really sub-menus. So let's go and check out how documentation menu looks like. When you click 3, you get into a new, it's the same window, but just cleaned up, and you see a sub-menu of documentation. We divided documentation in 3 parts: environment documentation, networking documentation, and security documentation. So I don't know if we'll have time to run all of the options, but we'll go over a few of them. So actually, why don't we just start with the first one, which is documenting all NSX components. All I have to do is hit 1 and enter. And what it's doing right now is it's connecting with the NSX Manager and vCenter to pull the information and creating an Excel in the background to put all that information together. This usually takes a good half an hour to pull all the information. And of course, depending on your environment, if you have a really big environment, it can take longer. I already have an Excel which has been created. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to that screen, and we can go over how the Excel looks like and what components we have in there.
Yeah. So let me quickly go over it. So in the Excel, what we're doing, and this is a common theme that you'll see across all the documents created, is that we're extensively using the tab. So each tab represents a component of NSX. So you have NSX Manager, you have 3 controllers, you have DLR control VMs, you have ESGs. So each of those entities will get a tab of their own. Now, it seems like a lot of you have been using Power NSX and Power CLI, so you're probably pretty familiar with the concept that vCenter use MOIDs and object IDs. And like personally for me, that's the most frustrating part, because finding that information before I can run a command, before I can run a REST API call, is just frustrating for me. And what we've done here is when you look at any of the outputs, we'll start with the basic component output. So you'll have the ID, the edge IDs, or the resource IDs if it's deployed on a cluster, what cluster it's on, what data store it's on, what are the different components. So for example, if you keep going, you'll see what the appliance summary is, what are the features that are enabled, for example, the bridging, DHCP, DNS, all the things. Edge, for example, comes with the firewall. So what does the firewall look like? What is the firewall config? And what are the rules for that? For the different features, like if you have HA, high availability, if it's configured or not configured, what are the timers configured as? You have load balancer in the edge. So what are the global configs and details on the load balancing? Then the cool piece about routing, you come in and you start looking at, okay, is routing enabled? What kind of protocol do I have? Now, many of you, if you've configured NSX, and especially the routing as we're talking about it, you know that there's like this menus and submenus, and then you have to double click something. Like when you go in and look at the filter for like the route advertisement, that's in a submenu. Now what happens is, like for the operations person who's not in NSX UI every time, every day, maybe coming in after 6 months when an issue happens, just finding that information, if you're not in the UI all the time, can be difficult. And that's one of the problems that it's solving, that you don't really need to go in the UI and try to find that. Control F, that's it. Just do a Control F, and you'll find the information. So here, as you can see, what is my neighbor? How many NICs do I have? How many, and what port groups they are connected to? What are the MOIDs for those port groups? All that information is in here. So for example, Edge is there. If we look at some of the others, let's say controllers or the NSX manager, now similar relevant information from controllers would be there. Like it will start with what are the installation or deployment details, what are the resource details, what is the cluster detail. Going into NSX Manager, similarly, what is the relevant NSX configuration? So this is initially, this is the 1.0 version of the tool. So what we've done is we've tried to dump all the config that's good config, but may not be perfect. We may have a little bit too much information, but it's too much is better than not having that information at all. Because sometimes, for example, if we looked at the output and thought, oh, OSPF is not enabled, let's not dump that configuration. Maybe that is the misconfiguration that happens later. Somebody enabled OSPF. So you want to be able to have something that can kind of look back at the key components and key configurations and make a differentiation between them. So that's a use case of like what we've done is we've created this document. Now it's up to you how you consume it. You can easily create a scheduled job to have it created every day. In our environment, as you will see later, we have to input some of the things, but in your environment, those things, information like cluster information and those things are gonna be same every time. So you can just hard code it into the answer files and stuff. And you can generate it as much as you can, as frequently as you can. And then when you run into issues, all you need to do is compare with the previous one and have a very quick view of, oh, this configuration value was this at yesterday when things were working, and today it has changed to this. So very quickly, time to resolution comes down because you know exactly where to look, or at least where to start, what has changed in the environment.
So I went ahead and canceled the documentation of all NSX components. Let's take a look at NSX host, ESXi hosts. Exit.
So with ESXi host, what we've done is a very similar concept, and in a distributed system, as you know, when you're using distributed routing, there's a ESX, the routing instance lives on every host, and every host has a routing table of its own. So what we are doing here is we are documenting that information. What is the routing table of the DLR on this host? So if you look at the bottom in the tabs, you have one tab for each host, right? So if host X is having issues or specifically, you can go directly to that tab and see what was the configuration like for this host and what has changed. I may be repeating myself, but the theme is common across all of the documentation that we're doing. So one cool thing here is, so let's say you're running into an issue and you're like, oh, the routing table doesn't look right. Now, let me look right now what the routing table looks like. So at that time, do I need to run the tool again? It's gonna take maybe take a lot of time to run get the output. So what we've done is we've documented the CLIs that you use to get the output. And the cool thing here is that it is custom, cookie cuttered for your environment. It has the IDs, the DLR IDs, the logical switch IDs, and all the IDs. So there's no guessing game anymore. There's no finding. copy, paste, run, get the output, right? So time to resolution, cut it down, bring it down, right? That's the aim, that's the purpose that we're trying to do here. Similarly, for NSX, VIBs need to be installed. When were they installed? What version they are? How many VTAPs do I have? 1 or 2? I have like 3 VDSs. Which VDS is prepared for NSX? What is the MTU? Is it configured right? So relevant information, all the information that's relevant for NSX is documented in here in a very consumable format. I love the fact that how easily I can use it. And oftentimes when I'm in my lab or I'm playing with things, I create these documents because it's even hard for me, who's in NSX every day, to query and run the CLI commands to find the information. When I have this, it makes it much easier for me to refer back to my own environments.
So we have other options also for environment documentation, but let's go ahead and take a look at some of the networking documentation.
So taking the same concept further, ESXi host had host information and the routing information. But so if you are familiar with routing in NSX, there are 4 different places that you can look for routing information. The ESXi, the edge at the top, then DLR control VM, then controllers, and the ESXi host, right? So I showed you the routing table documentation for ESXi host. What about the other 3 components? Now, oftentimes the challenge is in the distributed system, the distributed nature itself can be a challenge, right? Because when you're troubleshooting, you need to look at these 3 places, right? So what we are doing here is same concept. We're putting the relevant routing information, not just the configuration. So initially I mentioned 2 phrases, desired state and realized state. So desired state is the configuration that you did, and realized state is what happened due to that config. Even in a lot of physical environments, if I talk to customers, they say, we have a backup. And when we ask, what is it that you're backing up? Well, we are backing up the config. Okay, great, but oftentimes the config is not really the issue. The issue is that something happened, route flap happened, and the routes are not right, or something's changed. How do you know what route changed? How do you find that information? And that's what it's doing, that it's putting the desired config, what you configured, and the realized config, both in the same place. So up there you can see what did I configure, and down there you can see what resulted due to that configuration. And again, the command, how do I find it again right now, what it looks like, right? So one scenario that I play when we're talking about this is like if you're a senior network engineer or in your organization, and on the weekend you're out with your family and something goes wrong, right? And the ops guy calls you, say, well, it's down and I can't ping. And what you usually have to do is, all right, okay, let me drive home. You go home, you VPN in, you connect, and you start looking at routes, and you look at what's going on in the environment, and then you say, okay, this is what the issue is. Now, if you have a tool like this, then the conversation changes, because now the ops guy can check what was the output yesterday, what is the output today, and he can diff, and very quickly know what changed, and then he can take an output of that right now and send it, like let's say, an email to the network engineer saying, hey, we are having issue, and seems like this routing table is not right, and for example, the default route that we were learning is not coming in. So now see how things can change in your day-to-day, because that network engineer can right away say, oh, that should come from this next hop. Can you look if that router is alive or not? Or however you want to play it, but the conversation and time to resolution can come down very, very drastically.
So in this we have tap for all DLRs and all edges. Next, let's move to the security. And in here we incorporated a tool which was built by one of the SEs in Australia, Tony Saga, and the tool name is DFW2 Excel. So let's take a look how this tool looks like.
So thank you, Tony, for giving us this tool. This tool was independently available anyways, but we've incorporated it into PowerOps. So this is what I was referring to before. So you have an Excel file that has your NSX Firewall config. So the cool thing here, let's say if I'm looking at the layer 3 firewall, and let's say if I focus on the source. So the source type, for example, here it says it's an IP set. What's the name of it, and what's the object ID for it, right? So that whole information right there for you. Now, however you want to consume it, it's very easy. And if I switch to, for example, security groups, because that information is about security groups, that's service groups, sorry, the security group.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. So if you look at the security group, I had a very small environment, but see what it's showing you. What is the security group? Is it global, universal? What is the definition? What are the criteria that you're looking at? Is it dynamic? Is it static? And then at the bottom, it shows you the membership, like what's resulted in that membership, which VMs are part of that. So again, put your ops hat on. You know, those guys who are, you know, troubleshooting 15, 20 different vendor appliances, you know, you're running huge environments, you can't expect them to know everything and have it on fingertips.
Are there counters?
Sorry?
Counters? Rule counters?
The rule IDs are there.
Hit counts.
Sorry?
Hit counts. Hit counts.
No, we don't, because this is more of a config, right? Yeah. So if you look at, for example, tags, you can see what are the tags in your environment, which VMs those tags are attached to. There are some optional outputs. Let's say if you go to the VM addressing, in a small environment, this could be very useful because it has all the VMs and what are the IP addresses for them. It's an optional thing. When you run the tool, it will ask you, do you want to collect this information or not?
Great. Now, you know, earlier somebody mentioned about the Visio tool. So let's take a look how the Visio tool looks like. For that, I have a plate demo.
So a similar thing, you know, here the requirement obviously is that you need to have Visual installed on the laptop where you're running it. And what it does is when you select the option, it starts collecting information about your environment. And then it dumps it on the Visual. If you see at the bottom, it starts creating all the objects, and then it draws a picture for you. And if you see here, like if we start at the right bottom, you have a VDS, which is now non-NSX logical switch, where you have the controllers connected. And then over there, you can see that you have 3 logical switches where web app and DB, where the VMs are connected. Then you have a transit logical switch, which is connected to the edge at the right top, and the edge for the uplink has, you know, the HQ whatever port group as an uplink. It may be simplistic, but it's a very useful and quick way to generate information about your environment. There are switches in there. If you have a lot of VMs and you don't want to put VMs on the picture because it's going to make it cluttered, then you can turn the switch off so VM falls. Don't draw the VM, just draw the topology. But again, you know, making it very simple for your ops team to realize what is going on in the environment.
So we looked into the documentation menu. Let's quickly check out how the health check menu looks like. So to exit out of a submodule or submenu, all I have to do is hit 0. And let's take a look at the health check menu. So here we have few options. Not sure if you'll have time or want to go over each and every in details, but we'll take a look at few. So let's start with the NSX Manager test. It's a very simple test to.
So one thing I want to reiterate here is that sometimes you may ask, well, why do I have to run a health check for this? Isn't NSX already doing it for me? The answer is twofold. One is most likely NSX is already doing it for you, but this is a product of our learning. We went to a customer, we had to do some firefighting, we had to resolve issues, and we may have found out some corner cases where things are not working and maybe the monitoring is not catching it. And we've built these tools to go under the hood and validate those informations, right? And some of these have been productized already. Some of them have not been. So we continue to evolve on this. So this one that he's showing is NSX Manager test. You just put the information. It's going to connect to your NSX Manager and do a bunch of tests. A very simple test. And for all the tests, it's going to create an XML file so you can easily look at it. So for example, here, I'm only going to show the XML for one, but it's the same thing for others as well. So as you can see, what are the things that it tested? That it's looking that the vCenter NSX is connected to vCenter. the inventory update, because NSX needs to talk to vCenter to get the objects and all of that information is current. The very important services within NSX, they are also running and in good state. So if we look at another one of the options, and I'll save the best for the last.
So we do have a bunch of options here. Let's check out the VDR instance.
Sure. All right, so what's VDR instance? As I was saying, the distributed router is distributed, right? It's obvious. And it lives on all the ESXi hosts. So when ESXi host, when the VDR is created on ESXi host, it creates a VDR port. So the existence of VDR port on your host is a guarantee that the VDR instance is good, right? So in the earlier versions, we saw some instances where after the reboot, the VDR instance may not come up, or due to some issues, the host died and stuff like that. And how do we identify in the environment that it's good? So in one of the upgrades I was helping, there were about 70 hosts in the environment. And after the reboot, after the upgrade, we were so happy. Everything went good. And we were like, okay, let's run this test to make sure under the hood everything's good. And we found that 68 tests passed for the host, 2 failed. We were like, why did 2 fail? When we looked at the hosts were dead. For whatever reason, the reboot caused a PSOD and the host never came up. So traditionally, you'll have to rely on some other mechanisms to find, the host is down, and then investigation. But here, with using this tool, very immediately, very quickly, when you're doing major maintenance and changes and upgrades in your environment, you can validate if the distributed routing is good across in the environment.
In those 2 particular cases, in the UI was still showing as green for the host, but reality was different.
So here, so these instances need some input from you. For us, we are just typing it in, but for your environment, because this is not gonna change, like in your environment, whatever the cluster name is gonna be the cluster name all the time. So you find the cluster name information, you put what cluster you wanna test the VDR instance on, what is the VDS that is being used for NSX in that environment, you put that VDS information in here, and then you give the name of any of the logical switch VNI that you have in your environment. You can pick any, it doesn't really matter. Here, for example, we pick the transit logical switch and we put that number in there. And once we do that, it's gonna start making the connection, and it's gonna find out, connect to each ESXi host and make sure it's good. If any of them did not have the VDR instance, it's gonna show up in red, and you'll have it in XML file to document which one failed.
Let's check out web version.
Or the VTAP to VTAP maybe.
Okay.
So, because so VTAP to VTAP is one of the coolest tests. So how many of you in your NSX deployments have VXLAN, like routing, logical routing and switching as well? Perfect, very good. So the biggest challenge I see when you enable that in environments is the MTU change. I have not seen, maybe except 1 or twice, where you did the MTU change in the environment and it worked first time. You always have that one thing somewhere, one path, partial config, where the MTU change was not done or pushed. But what happens is you don't really have a way to tell which path has that failure. So you trust your configurations and you say green light, go ahead, we did some bunch of ping tests and everything's good, looks good. But then somebody like later on comes in saying, well, we have intermittent failures. And who doesn't love intermittent problems, right? So what this tool does is it goes in, so what you can do is you can pick either one host or you can say all hosts in your environment and say, I want you to do a real, not a synthetic, but a real ping test between all of my VTAPs, full mesh, and tell me which paths have any failure. So what it's gonna do is it's gonna connect to your ESXi host and say, okay, for example, I have a multi-VTAP environment and VMK4 and VMK5 are my NSX VTAPs. It's going to connect to host 1 and it will go to VTAP 1 and it will initiate 2 packet counts ping to all the VTAPs in the environment and it will document it. And then it will go to the next VTAP and it will do again. And then basically it's going to go across in your environment and do a full mesh ping test. And then what will happen? What it's going to do is it's going to produce an Excel for you, which with the output saying from, again, can we see that?
Excel?
I'm presenting so good, he's lost in the conversation. He's heard me 5 times already talking about it.
No,
So this is the sort of Excel that you'll see. So this is not all the pings, this is only the failed pings. That from host X, the host IP or name, VMK this, IP this, to IP this, VMK this, and host this, you had a failure. And then you have this nice chart. So one thing is that, well, this tool is a work in progress. So right now, what you will get is this kind of output in your, and we're hopefully in the next few weeks or so, we will be able to pull in the whole Excel. So the Excel piece is work in progress, but this is the kind of output that you'll still get when you run the tool. And you'll see from host VMK IP to host VMK IP failure. So now when you're troubleshooting, you don't need to trust anything else. You're like, okay, this exact path has a failure. And you can start your troubleshooting with a very pinpointed, very focused.
So let's go ahead and run that test. I didn't run it earlier.
So we have time for a few questions. So I'll pause in a couple of minutes again to take questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come up to the mic and we'll take the question in like a minute or 2. So if you see what it's doing is it's creating the Excel file and it's initiating the pings. So it's going to a specific host. I'm sorry, some of you may not be able to see, but it's going to a specific host and then it's starting to do the pings, right? And if you'll see that in the middle there are some reds that, you know, due to screen you're not seeing, but in the middle there are some reds and then some greens. And when this is actually my environment, and when I looked at it, what was happening, so everything within the same VTAP subnet was okay, but between the VTAP subnets, so I have 2 VTAP subnets, between the VTAP subnets there were failures. So I immediately knew that the Tor which is routing between my 2 VTAP subnets is where the problem is, right? So let's take some questions.
So how would this work with multiple vCenters and multiple managers?
So at this time, we don't have native support for multi-vCenter, so you can just run it independently in each, because what happens in the initial piece where you saw connect to NSX Manager and VC, whichever that you mentioned, that's the one that is going to connect to. And then you can run the same health checks.
Connects to one at a time right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On the VTAP to VTAP test, if it's ICMP test, that doesn't really work that well with if you've got like a ECMP fan out type of underlay. Are there any plans to, and it may be a host limitation of tooling, but plans to enable some sort of UDP test that can modify the source or desk ports to fan across the
That
spines?
actually, no, that's a great comment. The thing is that we potentially could, but if you are trying to do UDP or a TCP test, then you have to have something listening on that port, right? And it's more tweaking with your environment to have something running on the VTAP to listen on a specific port. But it's not that it can't be done. So as it's a work in progress in this community project, if you want to contribute to that, definitely, you know, we'll share the link and submit the issue, and we can work on it and we can get those enhancements.
Yeah, I think it probably would require changes on the host side of something that would be
That's the biggest
like known
problem.
ports or something, because
And you'll see in our wish list of the things that we are hoping to accomplish in the next few weeks or so. One of them is about, like, so this very simplistically, yeah, all's good, but when you go and talk to your operations guy, they may say, well, how does it do the ping? It'll say, oh, SSH. Well, SSH is disabled in the environment. Like, okay, then how do you do that, right? So one thing that we are hoping to accomplish is that the tool will ask you, do you want to enable SSH? So it will enable SSH, but not just overall, but enable it from a specific IP, like your host IP that you give, and it will run the test, and after the tests are done, it will disable SSH and come out. So, but those challenges, operational challenges, just ICMP can be so big, and if you try to open a new port for another test, that a lot of customers may not be able to consume it in their operations environment.
Last question real quick on the, I forget what menu it was, but where you had to type in the cluster name and to specify the VNIs, at least for the VNIs, is there an all option?
So right now you need to pull that information, but as I was saying, I had to type it in because I'm testing it out, right, in this environment. But when you are running this in your environments, your things are not changing. Your cluster name is not changing. Your VDS name is not changing. Your, the VNI is not changing. So you can just hard code it in your, it's a script. It's open source. Open it. Instead of asking for information, just hard code your information and voila, you go.
So repeat on VTAP to VTAP. The health check is available already. It's just the Excel we're still working on. It will be available shortly.
Just a quick question on the slide that you showed before for the controller routes and for the routes from ESXi host. And let's say if we have taken 2 backups of the routing table on the controller and on the ESXi host, is there a command that I can use in the Power CLI or Power NSX to kind of take a look at what changed instead of just comparing the 2 Excel sheets?
Well, it's a little bit more tricky problem because the way NSX works, the routing table at, for example, controller and the ESXi host are not going to be same. Because the routing table that controller sends are only the dynamic routes. All the static routes are pushed directly from the NSX manager to the ESXi host. So when you're looking at ESXi host, it's combining the things that it's learning from different sources. So if you were to just compare the routing table between controller and ESXi host, it will very likely be different.
Right. So is there something, some command that exists instead of just comparing the 2 Excel sheets? Maybe just, let's say I want to look at my controller information today and day before yesterday, what changed in the controller because it's a static environment. Is there something like that that exists?
So from an existing tools perspective, if you have VRNI, for example, that does that. From a tool perspective, it tracks changes, and you can slide and look at the time and see what config was at a certain amount of point in time.
Thank you.
Sure. We have actually goodies for you, and my colleague at the back will hand out for questions. Thank you.
When you run those ESXi DLR snapshots, if you are multi-tenant, do you get multiple DLRs responses back? Yeah,
actually, I didn't show in the because I didn't want to go through all the output, but in this environment, we had 4 DLRs and 4 universal DLRs, and it will show each of them.
Thanks.
When you run your test and you get a failure, is there any alerts, triggers, emails, or paging that you can do?
Right now, this is standard. This is like standalone, not standard. Sorry, standalone tool. Okay. It's not hooked up into something, but those are the kind of enhancements that we want to make. And what you can do, like if you have some automation capabilities, you can run scheduled tasks and based on the expected output, because your environment is same, right? If any test fails, you can have something that shoots an email, but it's not built into it yet. But that's a great one that we should.
Right. And we are planning to automate the scheduling for documentation and health checks. So if let's say you want to, every Monday morning you want it to go ahead and run all the documentation for you, it will do it. And also the whole health check and send you an email. So that's a part with.
All right, thank you.
Two questions. The Visio graphical part, is there a realistic size of the environment that can run against? I don't want to run it against an environment and have the thing completely blow up.
Yeah, so what I've seen is the NSX main components, the controllers, you'll always have only 3. The only thing is you can have a lot of edges and logical switches. So today what we have, and other VMs obviously, so there's a built-in switch to turn off displaying of the VM. I'll need to find out if that similar switch applies to different entities. So let's say you have hundreds of edges because all of them are load balancers, and you want to turn them off in the Visio, you probably can do that, but that's a follow-up question. If my colleague comes back, we can definitely answer, or I'll give you my card and you can.
Okay, and does this work against NSXT?
So that's in our wish list right now to get it against NSXT.
It's only for NSXP right now.
Yeah. Good question.
Hi, with the when it's pulling in the virtual machine inventory, when you're actually looking at the stuff that's attached, what are you doing with tags when you're pulling that out? Because one of the issues in our environment is we actually have a API call that takes the vCenter tag and creates a NSX tag with the same exact title, and that's how we use our dynamic entry into our groups. So the vCenter guys will take the tags and add that in. Is there any option for us to, I don't assume that it does that by default, is there an option for us in the community side to pull that part of the VM information out, like tags, and do a compare with NSX versus vCenter?
So that piece is very easily done with Power NSX. So here as well, it's a Power NSX call. So I would highly, actually, right there. So my colleague Anthony wrote the book and others from the team contributed. So you can do that from Power NSX, and it's probably just a one, maybe a bit long, but one command to achieve that.
Thank you.
And because it's baked with Power CLI, so you can probably run a script that pulls the vCenter tags and the NSX tags together. And you can push a creation as some are missing, for example.
Can this run at all in PowerShell Core? Is there any?
PowerShell Core.
No, we haven't tested that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Second, when you did the security groups and the members, was there a way to get the command that you pasted? I didn't see that command.
So it's not. So it's a Power NSX command that does it. So what we are trying to do here is automate the documentation. So some of the stuff that we see that like routing table, there may be an immediate need to know the command to do that. But with Power NSX, you can pull that information.
Just
That's what we're using. Another Power NSX question. Thank you. All right, so let's continue towards the end or later part of our presentation. It's what's around the corner, right? What are our wish lists? The first thing is the VTAP to VTAP Excel. Actually had it working, but there was some issue due to which we lost some code. Otherwise, it would have been ready for this time. The second thing I already mentioned, automatic enable disable. Support for load balancers, so we want to have like a table. If your environment has a lot of load balancers, then we feel that it's a challenge to know which VIP is hosted on which load balancer, for which protocol, which port, what are the backend, the pool members. So we want to have like a decent Excel file where that mapping is, as you can do a Control F, right? Love Control F. Auto install of all the prerequisites is also something that looking for. There's one more thing that we wanted to mention is that internally within our team, this tool is a part of a larger initiative where we want to package this with education. So help your operations team know more about their environment. And a part of that would be a workbook. So the idea of workbook would be that you'll have like 30 or 40 things, specific things in there, like just the headings of this is something that you need to know. And what you will do is if you're the operations guy or when you're preparing your operations team, you need to tell them you need to know how to do these 30 or 40 things. And what are those things? Like be able to look at a VM and find what firewall rules are applied to it. Be able to look at a router and see the routing table. Be able to look at this and that and get that information. In operations, they oftentimes need very concrete, specific SOPs. And the workbook would be something that they would build themselves. We won't fill it up for you. It will have a task and you'll create or you'll document it yourself. So at the end of when you're done with the workbook, what you've done is your operations team have documented your own environment yourself, right? So that workbook is something which is work in progress. In the next 4 to 6 weeks, we'll post it on the Git as well.
I can't stress this enough. It's a community-based tool, open source. We're really looking forward for our partners and customers who also contribute to the product, not only by adding new code, but if there are any issues, reporting those, or just sending us new feature requests. To do that, let me quickly go ahead and show you where the code lives right now. We have a GitLab repository under NSX PowerOps, and this is where most of our code lives. We also have a nice README file. This gives you a prerequisite step-by-step instruction. What are the prerequisites needed? And for some of them, like third-party modules, how to install them. We have more than one option to do that too. Visio is optional. Excel is needed. And you can simply download it by the download button on the top, or if you want to contribute, you can do it through the Git. There are a few notes on how to use the product. We have multiple branches right now, and also multiple commits. This is a new home to it, so we do not have a lot of issues showing up in here. It's right now 0, but in our older one we had a good list of issues, which mostly new features add, and some of the changes that we will be doing. So we'll be moving all that in here.
All right, with that, yeah, put the URL back.
Sure.
That'd be great. Yeah. Previous slide, where's the bigger, yeah. There you go. Yeah. Any questions, comment? So really appreciate you guys coming in. We'll stay back here if you have more questions. Please do fill out the surveys, very important to us. If you want to see this again next year and more iterations of it, that'd really be helpful. Thank you guys.